This last year, the world was introduced to a filmmaker who presented patterns of evidence, the Exodus. This is Tim Mahoney's story. Tim Mahoney, who grew up in America, who grew up learning about the scriptures from a youth, but he was one who then took his own due diligence and he went over to the Middle East, went over to Egypt. He wanted to do a movie about something he had believed his entire life, and that is the Exodus from Egypt. He set out to do just a one-year mission, and that's to produce a one-hour documentary. And when he got over there, he was confronted with the professionals who put in his face that there was no Exodus. Israel was never in Egypt, and the Bible is a fairy tale. And person after person, archaeologist after archaeologist that he met in the land of Israel kept on confronting him with this, and he came to his own crisis of faith. That crisis of faith has produced a movie which is shaking up the world because it put together Tim Mahoney and David Rohl, and they are now with us to present not only the evidence, the patterns of evidence, but also the story that goes along with it. We're going to get more background concerning the Exodus from Egypt than has ever been presented in the history of the human race other than those who were actually there at Mount Sinai. Those who actually walked out, they were the first-hand witnesses, and Moses told those people, you were there. You were there when you crossed the Yom Suf. You were there when the voice spoke from that mountain which was on fire. You were there. It wasn't someone else. And never before in the history of the human race has the Almighty spoken to an entire nation of people who are still alive there to that very day just before crossing over the Jordan River and taking the city of Jericho. Now all these things have been called into question, even though there were up to 2.5 million people who were there to experience it. Now these are being called into question, but yet the rocks are crying out. The rocks are crying out from the earth in this day and time. And so that is why we are presenting this weekend for the entire world to get more of the background, to understand the real roots of their faith is not just embedded in a book, but in the living archaeology in the land of Egypt and in the land of Israel. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tim Mahoney.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience out there for tuning in. You know, how do you begin to tell a story like this? It's taken, you know, it's thousands of years ago, 3,500 years ago, this story is said to have happened. And when we think about that event, a lot of people have questioned it. And here's what the Bible says. Let's pull up this first slide here. I'm going to share with you something. Oftentimes, when events like this happen, we wonder, did they really happen? Well, what the Bible says is, remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, for the Lord brought you out of here by the strength of his hand. That's Exodus 13:3. And what I didn't know, I'm just a regular guy like you. I ask questions, and I was on this journey. I'm going to share with you in the next half hour a little bit about who I am. In other words, how in the world did I get here? And I've asked that question. I remember being interrogated in the Middle East it was at night, we were camping, and this one man was saying, "Why are you here? What are you doing?" And I would say, "Well, I'm interested in Moses." "Well, you can't be interested in Moses, And I realized, I was a long way from home. I was like, I want my mommy, It was one of those situations where I realized that I had gotten myself into a place where the world was at a crossroads with this question about the Bible and the Exodus and what's happening. And this verse here became a very important verse for me because I started to realize that many people were forgetting the Exodus. They were forgetting the stories of the Exodus. They didn't really want to remember them. They wanted to forget them. And they were saying, well, this story didn't happen, and we shouldn't be observant of these ideas, the Passover. Many Jewish people are tired of it. Let's just throw that stuff off. And over 20 plus times at least, it's repeated this phrase, do not forget what God did by bringing you out of Egypt. And so that is an important understanding that came to me. So how did I get started in all this? You know, I grew up in a home. My father was a police officer, and my mother was a piano teacher, and they met at a school. They actually met at a Bible college. And eventually, I'm the oldest of 4 children, and the marriage didn't go well. And my father, eventually we left my father, and it was a single parent home. And my mother depended upon God and the Bible. And she would read to us. We had what we called family devotions. I don't know if anyone else remembers having that, but you'd sit with your family, and at night, before you go to bed, she'd read a chapter of a story, the stories of the Bible. And so these stories of Moses and of the Israelites and of Noah and of Joshua, well, I heard these stories when I was growing up, and I believed them as a child. But, you know, as you get older, people, you know, challenge you. Do you really think any of that really happened as you go off to school and you're starting to do the, you know, to be an adult? And so those were the same questions that I had. It wasn't that I didn't have faith. It's just that there's an unanswered question. So I grew up with an interest in music. I actually played a lot of music, and I thought music was going to be my career, and until I traveled with a group and understood what traveling was like, and it wasn't as glamorous as it looked, you know, from sitting in the audience. And so I ended up going to a movie. And the very first movie that I ever went to, I was from a conservative home. I hadn't gone to a movie theater until I was 18 years old. And I saw a movie called The Hiding Place. And if you've ever, The Hiding Place is a story about Corrie ten Boom. And she was a woman, and her family lived in Holland, and they had a little watch shop. And what Corrie did is her family created a place in their home to hide Jewish people during the war, World War II. And they helped, kind of like a railroad, to get Jewish people out of Holland. And I saw that movie 3 times in 1 week. And I had never seen cinema, so I was like, wow. And it didn't know at the time, but it had affected me in a powerful way. I thought I was going to be a musician, and but as time went on, I started to be interested, and I heard that a commercial for being in a film school, and I thought, what if I went and explored that? I never thought about that. So I took 2 years of college, and I went off to film school, and it was an amazing new idea that opened up for my life, to be actually the possibility of being a filmmaker. And then I met my wife, and I thought, what an amazing possibility to marry this woman. And I better get her before somebody else does. And so my wife Jill and I were married young, and we ended up raising a family, and my whole film school and all that kind of came to a stop. And I thought, am I ever going to basically, you know, move on and do this? And I actually worked in a body shop. My uncle taught me how to paint cars, and so I figured somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 cars. And I painted and sanded and painted, and I thought, I am stuck. Am I ever going to go on with this? Because I felt there's something in my heart that I was supposed to do. And there's actually a verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. It says that there are things that God has prepared for us before the beginning of time. And I realized, my wife told me about that. And I thought, well, that's amazing. I think that each one of us has something that we're supposed to basically do with our lives. And isn't that the challenge for a lot of people? They're wondering, well, why am I here? What's my purpose in life? And I think that all of us sometimes are wondering, you know, where did I come from? What am I supposed to be doing? Well, how should I live? And where am I going? And I think that so many people today are just sort of distracted. There's a good example. I don't have my car keys, but you're with a baby and you can take some car keys out and shake them, and the baby will go like this. You know, I've got 2 grandchildren that are about that age, and they'll go like that. You know, wherever you put the car keys, they'll look at it. And a lot of us are like that. We're kind of like just looking at shaking car keys. We're not really, you know, anything that comes along. You know, we're just distracted. And I didn't want to be distracted. And I was in that, painting those cars, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to get stuck here. And I eventually made my first documentary film. It was an outdoors documentary, and that got me into the world of advertising. And I started to, I realized I was good at it. I sold some of the biggest accounts that this agency had ever had. And the guy said to me, I don't get it. He says, you just seem so honest. And I said, he goes, I mean, you just seem so believable when you tell things. I said, well, because I believe them. You see, I believe what I'm saying, and so I was able to help other people see things. And I have an ability to see things that I can visualize ideas. And one time a consultant told me, you see the problem and the solution very quickly before people even know they have a problem. And he says, not many people can do that. And I can see things. And one of the challenges for me making this film was that I could see things, and I was afraid that we would never get them made, because I could see it, and I was very concerned and frustrated that it wouldn't get done, because it took such a long time. And so as my career had gone on in the advertising world, I grew a company, and I grew into, and I continued to develop. I started my own business. I left the first agency, and I went and started my own, and started developing films and videos for corporate America, and commercials, and it was a great education. I did a lot of filming in the outdoors. I made fishing reel commercials, and I filmed in Florida, and I filmed in the mountains, and I filmed all sorts of different places. You know what it did is it prepared me to film in the desert, and it prepared me to film, all these different places. I've made underwater commercials before. We searched for underwater stuff for the Exodus. So I was being sort of trained, as it were, to basically prepare. Michael said something interesting, very complimentary. He says, Tim, I mean, it's just like this was for you. And I look back on it now, and I can see that this project was for me, because I have also context is one of my strengths. And if you read my Strength Finder, if you've ever heard of Strength Finders, it gives you your major strengths, and one of them says that you'll be very comfortable talking with historians trying to understand the past. And I was like, that is crazy, how I got to that point. And I think that I started realizing that, hey, you know what, historians like David Rohl and Israel Finkelstein, they're looking for that conversation. And I was fascinated by it. And I wasn't, in a way, I was more of, it's kind of like a hand in glove. I was a person who wanted to tell stories, and there were people that had stories to tell. And then I realized as I was making this film that I was part of the story. And then I started to realize that you have to have a story in order to tell a story, you see. And so as a filmmaker, which I wanted to become a filmmaker, and so in the very beginning, we had a person that you might be aware of, Billy Graham, and he had an office in Minnesota. And I was fascinated and very excited about the possibility of going and doing something, because he made the film The Hiding Place. His organization made that. So I was like going to find a way in there and try to get to Worldwide Pictures and work with them. And I did. I actually convinced them, even though I wasn't capable, I was certainly interested and had the energy of working with them. And so I started to show up at their movies. When they would make a movie, I was making the story about the making of the movie. And I got that job, and we did that for 4 different movies. And then I created all the marketing materials for television and the video. And I also, then I was able to make a film for him, a commercial for Billy Graham, one of his last ones, called Good News is Coming. And that was, I feel very proud of that. In fact, the idea, I remember when I shared the idea with the staff, they said, well, where's your research? And I said, well, I don't have any. I just feel like this is what we're supposed to say. And good news is coming. And it had a double meaning, and so we took that double meaning, and we made a commercial with a newsstand where someone would walk up to a news, box. Remember those boxes? You'd pull the newspaper out. And every time the door slammed, the headline would change. you know. So it would be really bad news, you know, like world at war, or whatever it would be. And then the last time, and the narrator said, "Does it ever seem like all you hear is bad news?" And it goes bang, bang, you know, bang. And he says, "But guess what? Good news is coming." And then it had the face of Billy Graham on the front of it. And that was the idea for that commercial. So I started to understand how to create creative messages in a very short window and try to understand how do we get people's attention and how do I think differently about information, and to make things so that creatively, you know, so one of my big clients was a company called Abra, and my cousin started Abra, and it's an Abra auto body. They're expanding across the nation. So I had to come up with ideas. So one of them was perfection. Perfection's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it, you know. So we came up with these ideas, because you don't want your car when it's fixed to come back and be okay. Oh, that's okay. You know, you want it to be perfect if it was perfect before it got hit. So I started to work on those kinds of communication ideas because they're very important for me it was preparing me as I was moving on. So I came from this advertising marketing background and worked with these big companies. Minneapolis has, you know, Pillsbury, and I did work for them, and Grand Met and Honeywell, and I learned an awful lot through that. And if you look at the Bible, you'll see that characters in the Bible also had a seasoning, right? Right? You know, Joseph killed a lion and a bear, and then he killed a giant, and then he went on to be king. And so God somehow prepares people, I think, for the task that he's given them. And so, so when I heard about this idea of a film, you know, about the possibility of there being Exodus, I didn't want to get stuck just making commercials. And I wanted to do more. Remember, I felt, you know, Ephesians chapter 2:10, you know, I had this sense that I was supposed to be doing something, so I was looking for it. I don't know if any of you ever felt like you got something. Well, I think what you do is you have to write that down. You have to basically say, okay, I better figure this out, you know, because life is short. And so, so I ended up going on in 2002, and this is in 2001, I had heard about the Red Sea crossing and this information a lot of people had been involved with. And I got a little bit involved with that, and I met different people. And I was like, this sounds really good. I'd made a couple other national TV specials in the past. And so I actually worked on the Bible Code and produced the Bible Code for, I think it was on Pax and Discovery. And then I did Jesus, Divine or Da Vinci, and we made some of these types of films. And so Exodus was like, wow, that is so fascinating. So what I ended up doing was getting it all set up to go. And then we had 9/11. And that just threw kind of everything into a tailspin. And about 6 months after 9/11, I just felt like, you know what, we got to do this. And I ended up going to Egypt and starting the whole process of going into production in Egypt. And I couldn't get any, I could not get any people to help me, except one Egyptian crew agreed that they would, you know, that I would be, you know, that they would help me. And they were Muslim. And so here I am with this Muslim crew, and I remember going there and going into the Cairo neighborhood, you know, and hearing the call to prayer, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I hope this is safe, you know. I'm not sure where they're taking me and what's all, but they turned out to be fantastic partners. Muhammad and Muhammad and Muhammad were all excellent. We're all excellent partners to help me. And we worked our way for a month through Egypt, and then this leads me to, we went to Karnak Temple. This investigation continued to expand as I went to Israel and to other places. And I was with a person by the name of Dr. Leonard Moeller, and I think I'm going to take this badge off here in case it's reflecting. I forgot that I had it on. I'll just throw it right here. And Dr. Leonard Moeller is from Sweden. He's a DNA research scientist, and in many cases, he's another person who probably has, sometimes we could say, well, why in the world is he doing something? he was just fascinated. He's always been fascinated by history. He's a scientist, and he wanted to take the scientific approach. And so we connected, and both Leonard and I went together to Egypt and to Israel, and we've been to other places in the Middle East. And so that was sort of the beginning. This here is him looking at the Brooklyn Papyrus, and he was gathering, he's a photographer, and he was gathering lots of data, and you might have heard of his book, The Exodus Case. And so that was sort of the very beginning stages. But I started to realize that he had a theory, and I was a filmmaker. And I realized that there were multiple theories. And what I had to do is, it took me a while to figure out, was I going to go down one theory track, or was I going to look at patterns? And he was looking for patterns too, by the way, Dr. Moeller. And I started to understand that I needed to have more voices in this film. And eventually, we went down the Sinai, and we did all sorts of filming there, and we went to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea, and we went to all the lakes, the Bitter Lakes, and I think it was Timnah. We went to the Gulf of Suez. We filmed all these different places, and I ended up with this here is the Nueva crossing location, and we ended up going to, I had to get to the very location, to this dig site. This was my goal, and this was where Manfred Bietek, who had been uncovering for the last 30 years where we believe that the Israelites were, where they came in, where Joseph came, and where his family settled. This was the land of Goshen, Tel El Daba. And so it's also a city that was right next to the city of Ramesses. So it kind of all made sense. And so when I went to see Manfred Bietek right here, he was not happy that I arrived with a film crew, because he didn't know anything about it. Well, I had been emailing him, but he's from Austria, but he was in Egypt, and he wasn't getting my emails. But I thought it was just like finding Livingston in Africa. Because I had searched for him, I had gotten there, it wasn't easy to get there, and when I got to him, I said, Manfred, I'm so excited to meet you. And he goes, you should not be here. You can't just interrupt everything. And so I told everyone, I was like, leave, guys, go back to the car. And I just stood there, and it was quiet. And you could hear this pump going, dat, 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 dat. There's pump for the machine, the equipment that's keeping the water out of the dig site. And I said, listen, I said, I really respect you. I said, I've come a long ways. I've been trying to meet you for such a long time. I said, could you just give me 5 minutes? And he agreed to give me 5 minutes, because I wanted to ask him a question. And I said, have you found any evidence for the early Israelites? And he said, so far, not. Now, when he said that, I was absolutely shocked, because that was the first time I ever conceived that, because I thought I thought he had uncovered information. That's why I wanted to go see him. And so it was such a setback that I almost, if you've ever had this, when I was a kid, I played catcher once. And I remember I was down in the position like this, getting ready to catch the ball. And the next thing I remember, I was waking up by the backstop, and I was hearing this sound of a bell. And apparently someone threw the bat and knocked me out. And I went to the hospital. Well, if you've ever ran into a tree or done anything like that, you have this ringing in your head, and you have this sort of consciousness that you're trying to wake up. I had it happen one time when I was having like a Passover meal with really strong horseradish. I lost consciousness for a moment. I was so hungry, I treated it like a cheese dip, and I just put it all over that cracker. Anyway, the whole point of it is that for a moment there, after he said so far not, you get the idea, I was like shocked. It had that kind of impact. And I tried to shake it off, and we filmed the site, and we went on, and we ended up filming other locations. And I went to England, I went to Liverpool and filmed Ken Kitchen, a very famous Egyptologist. And I went home. And you know what? That seed of doubt started to grow in my heart, in my mind. And I was sitting in an edit suite. Let's see if I got what's happening here. So this is where a crisis of faith started for me. I had this huge challenge in my mind that I had been to the location, and I talked to the guy who should know. He should know very, very well whether or not there's any evidence, and he just told me no. And I was just sitting in that edit suite. The thought came to me. This cold chill came over me. Maybe everything that you've been believing in, everything your mom told you, your whole family, your relatives, is a lie. And it was a cold moment. And it's scary, and because I thought I had done it. Now I had pushed the envelope to go there, and not many people go to the sites and actually, say I'm going to lay the glove down and go to this. I pushed it, and I said, had I pushed too far? And at that moment, another thought came to my mind: stop editing, and get up, and go to your office. And so I walked out of the edit suite, crossed the hall, into my office, and there's a bookcase. Go to the bookcase, went to the bookcase, read that book, and pulled this book out that I forgot about. And it was a book called Pharaohs and Kings. And I opened the book, and it was written by David Rohl. And David will be sharing in a little bit his ideas. And I opened it up, and David Rohl had the very same site that Manfred Betek had been digging at, but he was interpreting it in a whole new light. And once I started seeing that, he was basically saying that there is evidence for the early Israelites. There is evidence for Joseph. And that's basically, I said, I have to talk to this man. And that began the process of me going on this long journey and coming to this point where I was able to then take a new approach. And I went to England, and I was able to spend the day with David, and I filmed him and asked him just a ton of questions. And in the very beginning, I only had about 3 minutes of information about Joseph and the family in the very first film that I made. I've made about 3 Exodus films. 2 of them you've never seen because we never felt that they were ready. And so the film that we're going to show tonight, and that we're very excited about and has done really well, was those 3 minutes got turned into 2 hours. So that's how much information. You see, what's so interesting about this is that there is a ton of valuable material that I became aware of. That I didn't do it, but as a filmmaker, I have the ability to set it up. And I think that's where I have been a great help to a lot of the archaeologists. And I started to realize in this process that as we were searching and looking for, this is my office here, as we were searching, and this was the bookcase actually where I found the book. You see, I love books, but I don't always read them. I don't know if anyone's like that. Does anyone buy books and this to go, I got this book, I love this book, the smell that is new, and you flip through it and you look at it and go, someday when I go on vacation, I'm going to read this book. And the other thing is, I actually have a bookcase. I don't know if many people have bookcases next to their bed, but I actually have a bookcase next to my bed full of books. And it's kind of like, I don't watch TV. I just basically say, okay, let's see. I moved for Arabia Felix, and I pull that out, or I'm going to do Jefferson. I love books, and so I was able to. Well, that's the case, and I've got a bunch of them there that I haven't read either. There's some grandchildren on the left-hand side. And so anyway, so what ended up happening was we started to realize, I have a writing partner, Stephen Law, and people started coming, being a part of our team. And there's about 8 people on my staff right now, and I have a partner in the film, a major partner, David Wessner, who's helped an awful lot. His family has helped fund much of what we've done. We've taken a commercial approach to this. So part of what we've been doing is we're trying to understand what is the basis of our investigation is the scriptures. We had to look at the Bible and understand the scriptural side of it. And so as we looked at that, we started to see that there was a prophecy that was given. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. And there's more information about these phrases and how we look at them that we'll get into. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. Genesis 15:14. And then after 4 generations your descendants will return here to this land. So we thought, okay, that's a prophetic word. And the Bible is a testimony of God's prophetic, he's foretelling and he's forthtelling. And as we look at this here, we started to realize that we created a device called the Wall of Time because it's visual. And what we did is we were able to take in the Wall of Time is to put the Egypt's history on the first level, the lower level. Down here is Egypt's history. In the middle is the Bible's chronology. And then this is Canaan, or the land of Israel history. And so we were able to see that there's an arrival, a multiplication, a slavery, a judgment, an exodus, and a conquest. That began the process of finding a way to start from scratch, start all new again visually, to take you, the audience, on a journey with the Bible in one hand and basically go look and say, where are the patterns? Let's go talk with people. And so the patterns of evidence approach then was born. And it's been brilliant. I mean, if I don't say so myself, because I think it was inspired. You see, because we're not that smart, but we could actually see Pete Windall. We wrote down all sorts of names. We were talking about patterns, but he put it down as a title. And I said, I think that's the title of it. And people hated this title, Patterns of Evidence, in the beginning. I think David Rohl hated it. He thought it was clinical. But you know what we did is we took the position of science. It's beautiful because it is the scientific approach. Look for a pattern. Does it repeat itself? Does the apple fall from the tree? Then I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or does it? So anyway, what ends up happening is that we started realizing that patterns of evidence, Exodus, Moses, Jerusalem, you see, we can now have a franchise to look for things because the world continues to say, faith is over here, and keep it over there. Reason is over here, and we're the intellectuals, we're the reason. And we're saying, no, there's no separation. Faith and reason work together. And so that's the idea. And I created a company called Thinking Man Films. And I realized that I wanted to be a thinker. And what I'm doing now is challenging the audience, challenging you, the audience, to become thinkers. That don't separate faith and reason, but become a thinker. And that is when we started Thinking Man Media, and we published. I thought, well, we published the book, Patterns of Evidence. We took what was 55 pages of script into 400 pages of additional material, things for you to think about. And then we published also David's new book, Exodus, Myth or History, which he's going to be talking about just shortly. And we produced more products. And I started to realize that, you know what, there are ideas and theories. What's the consistent is the biblical story. Let's look at the narrative. People will throw ideas about theories about how to interpret it or where is the evidence. And there might be multiple theories that we can look at, correct? And that became the approach for Patterns of Evidence. So I realized that I could talk with Mansour Brayak in Egypt, who's a Muslim, and he gave me great information. And he said, think, you might have a theory. Let's talk. You discuss with me. It was a beautiful what he suggested in the film, which you'll see. I couldn't believe how he set it all up. And we could talk with Kent Weeks, who did KV5, Valley of the Kings, and give his impressions of it, of the story. And I started to realize that I wanted to have a conversation with the world, not just with one idea or one person. And so that's where we brought it open. And we realized that the more we opened it up, the more people the larger the audience became. Because now we've got great people, and this story affects everyone. And here I am in Israel. I'm trying to think of her name at the moment. And this is Israel Finkelstein at his dig site. And he cares deeply about the Bible. He's written the book, Bible on Earth, which many people say, well, he doesn't unearth the Bible. He basically says it didn't happen at the time that we think it happened. But he cares. And I've become a friend of his, I believe. And this is David Rohl and us. This was the last time we were in Egypt, 2 years ago. And so the story begins with Joseph, as you know. And so for me as a filmmaker, and I'm going to introduce David here, and he's going to get up now and share, is let me just tell you that as we go through, I realized that we had to look at the story as it was with Joseph and his coming into power through the dreams that he interpreted for Pharaoh, and the fact that his family was invited in to the event of becoming a part of Egypt. And then eventually they became so numerous that they were enslaved, right? The Bible says they were enslaved. And that eventually a deliverer came, and it was baby Moses. And he grew, then he fled to Midian, and he was before a burning bush, and God said, go back. And then he goes back, and he basically says, Abraham said, these people are going to be punished. These people are going to be punished because what they've held you, and then these plagues come. This is the river turning to blood. And then the final plague, the death of the firstborn. And then they leave, and they go to Jericho, the first city of the conquest. And these walls are, they're up to the skies, it says. They're huge cities. And the walls, they march around the city and blow the shofar. And the walls come tumbling down, and then eventually Joshua leads them, and they renew the covenant. That's sort of the story that we had. We thought we'll take this part of the journey up to this part, because these are the markers where people say there's no evidence for this story of the Bible. The next film that we work on, God willing, will be on the route of the Exodus. And which way did they go, what sea did they cross, what mountain, and what happened at Mount Sinai that changed the world. There was just too much information for this one. Remember, we took 3 minutes and turned it into 2 hours. And I thought, let's be thorough. And that's one of the things that we've been very, very thorough, because I think it's in the pattern. You have to remember now, one idea, one little piece of evidence doesn't make, but when you can get a sequence of ideas and patterns that keep matching each piece, it's the sequence. So I think that when people discredit certain things, you have to look for the pattern and for the sequence. That's where the strength is. And with that, I'd like to introduce my friend David Rohl.
That has to be the longest introduction I've ever had. This morning session is all about journeys that we make personally in life, and Tim's told you his journey and how he came to make this fantastic movie. My journey started when I was very young. I was told by my parents that I was interested in Egypt from a basically 5-year-old. And they told me that I used to write down the names of the Egyptian pharaohs in hieroglyphs and in Greek and in English, all the way through from the 1st dynasty to the 30th dynasty when I was 7, even before I could write properly. So this thing has been ingrained in me from childhood. I don't know why. I've no idea why that's the case. But I ended up going to Egypt at the age of 9 for the first time. I insisted that my mother take me there. I wanted to go, and there was no two ways about it. She was going to have to take me. And this was in 1960. And if you know the story of Egyptian politics, that was just after the revolution when Nasser, he took over the Suez Canal from the British, seized it and nationalized it. And that caused the French and the British to invade Egypt. And there was a sort of skirmish for a few days, and the Americans said, stop this messing around and get out. And of course, Nasser went on to be the longest reigning president in Egyptian history. And it was about 2 or 3 years later when I went to Egypt, and you could still see the bullet holes in the buildings at Ismailia and Suez. And the king of Egypt had been thrown out of the country a few years earlier with the revolution. And there happened to be his royal paddle steamer berthed up at the banks at Cairo. And it was commandeered and turned into a boat for people like me to go traveling up and down the river. So I ended up at the age of 9, sleeping in King Farouk's bed in his cabin. He wasn't there at the time, he was in Italy at the time. Sailing all the way to Abu Simbel through the English dam locks, into what has now become Lake Nasser, but was originally the River Nile, through Sudan, and arrived at Abu Simbel in the dark. The boat was actually amazing. It was made of mahogany and brass, and the staff were all dressed in galabeahs, blue galabeahs with gold bandanas and turbans on. It was a completely different world to what you see if you've been to Egypt these days. Very different world. As I say, I was only 9 years old. And so the Rais, the captain of the boat, put the gangplank down onto the beach in front of Abu Simbel. This is before it was moved up higher, in the dark, and he gave me this huge big brass key, about this size, in the shape of the sign of life, the Ankh symbol. And he said, off you go, down you go, on your own. Go and open the big door over there, and open the temple up and going inside on your own. So I had this brass key, the sun was rising across the river, lighting my way, opened this huge door, it must have been about 25 feet tall, pushed it open, and it led directly to the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Ramesses II, Abu Simbel. And there's this little kid, 9 years old, with the sun lighting his way to the Holy of Holies, the long shadow pointing in the direction. And that was my introduction to Egypt. That's how I became in love with the country and the civilization. And I've had it with me all my life. But then, as you do, when you're a teenager, you get involved in rock and roll. Remember, this is the 1960s. So I turned into a rock and roll star for a few years. I formed a band, and we went playing the American bases in Germany, just like the Beatles had done. Did all that, and I became a recording engineer, some of the most famous studios in England, and eventually a record producer working for George Martin, who was the Beatles producer, with his team of elite producers, working with lots of very famous bands, some of them American as well, some American artists. And I did that for around 25 years. But all this time, I had this passion hidden behind there for Egypt. I'd been reading books about the subject, and I still wanted to do something with that spark that I had. And I managed to earn myself enough money to be able to leave the music industry. To be quite honest with you, I was fed up with it by then. Working in studios for 15 hours a day, 3 months at a time, smoking 60 cigarettes a day in those days when you used to smoke, because I had nothing else to do with my hands apart from mixing. And my ears were getting ruined by the sound the whole time, so I gave it up. I gave up music, and I decided to go to university. I'd already done a degree in photography when I was younger, but this time I said, right, now I'm going to do what I really want to do, which is what I want to study ancient Egypt. And I had a fairly decent background in the subject already. So I applied to go to University College London, and the Egyptology department there is an extraordinary thing. It was actually the first Egyptology department in the world. It was set up by Flinders Petrie, the famous archaeologist. And it's such a small department that they only accepted 3 students every year. So the total department was 9 students over the 3 years of a BA course. And I went there not knowing how many other people were applying for the 3 places. It turned out there were 97 applications for those 3 places. And I got one of them. What they saw in me, I don't know. But they said, we want you. You're a mature student. You already have a background in the subject. We know we're going to be interested in what you have to say. So I spent my 3 years learning the tools of the trade. It's very important when you do something like studying ancient history that you learn the methodologies. You learn how to research. You learn how to put things together, piece the information together. And that's the difference, I suppose, between an academic training and an amateur who goes to Egypt and doesn't really know how to do the job properly. It's like a carpenter. You have to learn how to do it. So I spent 3 years doing that, but all the time I'd been researching. While I was a musician producer, I'd been searching for something to focus on. And I could see a period in Egyptian history which fascinated me. And it's a period that nobody else wanted to bother with. Now, it's a horrible title, but it's called the Third Intermediate Period. What that basically is between the 3 main kingdoms of ancient Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, you have dark ages. They're called intermediate periods. So you get the first intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period. And after that, you get into classical history. So we know all about that, and that's the Hellenistic period, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians. And what fascinated me was this third intermediate period, nobody touched it. Nobody would dare go there. In the BA course that I was doing as a university student, they jumped from the New Kingdom to the classical period. They just left it alone. They couldn't touch it, because even the professors didn't know what it was all about. And that fascinated me, because I like solving problems. I love the challenges you get in solving mysteries. And this was a big mystery to Egyptology. So I became a chronologist. And what that basically means is I studied the timeline from the end of the New Kingdom, which is the 20th dynasty, through to the 25th dynasty. So dynasties 21 to 25 is this dark age called the Third Intermediate Period. And I could see that somehow or other over the last 150 years, scholars had messed this period up in a big way. They'd stretched the chronology. They'd got all the information together and made a big hole, and they just threw things in it to try and get it to all fit. But that wasn't the right approach. Instead of working from the known, which is our history, backwards to the unknown, they had selected a particular synchronism, and that's something where you have a link between Egypt and another country or another civilization. They'd locked those two things together, and they'd filled in the gap down to the present. So they hadn't used internal Egyptian evidence to work out the chronology. They'd used a synchronism from another civilization. And you'll be surprised to hear that civilization is the Bible, the Israelites. They'd used a biblical reference to a pharaoh, and he's actually the first pharaoh mentioned in the Bible. If you know about Joseph's pharaoh, you know about Moses' pharaoh, but you don't know the names, do you? They don't give the names. The first time you hear a name of a pharaoh is when Solomon's temple is plundered and the Egyptians take the treasure from the temple back to Egypt, which you've all seen in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones goes to Tanis and he finds the golden ark there, which has been brought back by Pharaoh Shishak. Okay? You probably never even heard of Shishak. When you read your Bibles, you probably skipped over that little bit in Kings and Chronicles. But Shishak marched up with a huge army to Jerusalem. He destroyed the fortified cities in the time of King Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. So Solomon's just died. 5 years later, King Rehoboam is in Judah, ruling there. He fortifies Judah against an attack from Egypt. The Pharaoh comes up, he attacks these fortresses, he gets to Jerusalem, and he then seizes the treasure from the temple and the palace. A very, very important moment in Israelite history. And we have a name of a pharaoh, Shishak, and he's dated to the 5th year of Rehoboam when he sacked the Temple of Solomon. So scholars linked onto this thing and said, right, now we've got a synchronism between Egypt and the Bible. If we can work out the date of that year 5 of Rehoboam, we can date a pharaoh called Shishak, and we can tie the whole Egyptian timeline together. So they looked for a pharaoh called Shishak. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to throw you into the deepest, darkest hole you've ever been in your lives. We're going to go into 30 intermediate period chronologies just for now. In fact, Michael challenged me yesterday. I wasn't going to deal with this at all. I got up at 5 o'clock this morning and put this thing together very quickly for you because I wasn't intending to talk to you about this. But in the end of the day, it's part of this journey. This afternoon, we're going to talk about the actual evidence for the Exodus and the conquest and the sojourn. But I think you need to know why we have this problem. Why is it that scholars think the Bible stories of Exodus aren't true? Why are pious fiction, as they call them? And the reason is because of this mistake that was made with Pharaoh Shishak. So I'm going to have to deal with that for you now. So you need probably to be wide awake for this, and you're going to learn something about the complexities of Egyptian chronology. Okay? So just hang in there, because later on this afternoon you're going to get all the goodies. Now we're going to do a bit of work, okay? And you're going to have to do some hieroglyphs as well. You all right with that? Okay, so I'm going to explain why Shishak is not the Pharaoh Shoshenq that all the historians and the Egyptologists say he is. So we're going to start now with the discovery of Shoshenq I and Shishak. It all began with a guy called Champollion, a French scholar who was the person in 1822 who deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Very famous, is called the father of Egyptology, because for the very first time in that 1822, we were able to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs for the first time, starting to read the king's names, read the events, the stories that you find on the temple walls. And so it was a crucial moment in Egyptology. It was actually the birth of Egyptology in 1822. Now, you can see there the Rosetta Stone. This is the document that he used to decipher the hieroglyphs in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in Demotic, which is a cursive form hieroglyphs, and in Greek there. So he was able to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs using the Greek, which we can all read, okay? And he came up with various names like Cleopatra and Ptolemy that he read from this document. But what he really wanted to do then was to go and test out his theory, test out his decipherment by going to Egypt, and he went to Egypt a few years later. He went between August 1828 and December 1829, and he went along with a team of scholars, and he went there specifically with the Bible in one hand and a trowel in the other, to go and investigate ancient Egypt and find evidence for the biblical story in the one part of the world where now we could read the texts. So he thought we can unlock the history of Egypt in relationship to the Bible by going there and reading the walls of the temples. And the place he went to was Karnak, one of the main temples in Egypt. It is literally a book, because you walk the walls of that place and you can read the history of Egypt there, especially during the New Kingdom, the greatest empire period in Egyptian history. And he went to one particular wall. This wall is on the outside of the temple. You have the great court there and the first pylon here. But this wall here has got a relief on it, a carving. And it's actually a battle inscription. It's about a campaign of a king into the Holy Land. And so he went there to look at the document, and he found that the people that were captives brought back from this campaign were what we call Western Asiatics, or Semites. In other words, this campaign was in Canaan, up in the north. It wasn't down into Africa. It was up north, out of Egypt, beyond Sinai. And a line drawing was done of this particular wall to make it a little bit clearer. And what you can see here is the Pharaoh smiting his enemies, who were all clustered together, in a ritual slaughter. And on the left-hand side, we have a scene where the god Ammon, with the tall plumes, is dragging with ropes attached to his hand here, a series of figures with ovals. Now, we know from looking at wall reliefs, what this is a representation of various locations in Canaan, cities or locations, whose names are spelt out inside these name rings with figures of the captives above. And I'll go and show you them in detail in a minute. And you can see there's row upon row of these. There's another group down here where the goddess Victorious Thebes is also bringing more of these name rings towards the smiting scene. There are about 150 altogether of these names. It's a huge campaign. Now, one thing you have to know about this particular inscription is that it's an itinerary. So it's actually the route of march of Pharaoh's army through Canaan. And it's read in a special way called bustrophodon. Anybody heard of bustrophodon? It's Greek, it means as the ox plough. So you read it starting here, you go along with your plough, and you turn around and you go down a row and you come back, and then you read it in that direction. And then back again. As the ox ploughs, bustrophodon, like this. So you start here, and you read along, and you drop down, and you come along that way, and then down again, like that. And because we know that, and we know that because of which name rings are connected together, we can actually work out the route that the army took through Canaan. Now, Champollion was stood in front of this wall, and he thought he'd found something very, very important. He related it to a text in the Bible, in 2 Chronicles 12, 1-4. And thus it happened that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, marched on Jerusalem, because they had been unfaithful to Yahweh. He had 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry and countless hordes of Libyans, Sukkim, which is another form of Libyan tribes, and Cushites, they're the people from the south in Sudan, who came from Egypt with him. They captured the fortified towns of Judah, and then they reached Jerusalem. This is the key synchronism I mentioned earlier. So here we have a pharaoh on a wall at Karnak whose campaign inscription appeared to match the story in the Bible. Now, was he right? Well, here we see part of that inscription. And you can now see the figures of the captives with the name rings and the crenellations showing the fortified towns here, and their names are spelt out in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he focused on that one there. He was able to read all these, and he was able to read it in a way that really shocked him, because this is his drawing of the actual relief. He could read the name Judah HaMalkuth, which means Judah the kingdom. Now, he knew his Bible. They were talking about scholars from the 19th century. They're very knowledgeable about the biblical text. They're brought up on the biblical text, and they immediately thought, this has got to be Shishak campaigning in the kingdom of Judah. And it just so happens the name of this pharaoh who carved this wall is a pharaoh called Shoshenq. And he thought, Shishak, Shoshenq, they sound very similar. So this must be the biblical character Shishak who went and plundered the Temple of Solomon and captured the fortified cities in Judah. And from that point, we get the synchronism between the Libyan pharaoh Shoshenq, the founder of the 22nd dynasty, and Rehoboam in his year 5 when the Temple of Solomon was plundered. And that lock has been with us ever since. We still use it today. All Egyptologists use that lock today. Doesn't matter what you do with the chronology, that is a fixed point that you can't change. But within 20 years, other scholars who now had developed the reading of the hieroglyphs in a more sophisticated fashion reread that name. Instead of Yud HaMalkuth, it actually reads Yad HaMelech. And you can see that. This is where you get your first hieroglyphic lesson today. 2 reeds represent Y. The little chick bird is an A. You have a hand, which is D. Then you have HaMelech. That's the K down there. That's the R, the lion. And so it means hand of the king. It does not mean the kingdom of Judah. And what it actually represents is probably an inscription like a monument or a stela that's been erected somewhere in Israel that is a monument of a record of a campaign of an Egyptian pharaoh. And it's mentioned here. And I'm going to show you why it can't be the kingdom of Judah. The first reason is that very close, within a couple of these name rings from Yad HaMelech, we have this name ring, and that name ring reads Aruna. Aruna. And Aruna, of course, is not anywhere near Judah. If we look at a map of Israel, we see Aruna is located at the Aruna Pass, which comes through from the Jezreel Valley onto the Sharon Plain, very close to Megiddo. Megiddo is just located here. It's a long way from Jerusalem. And so Yad HaMelech, which is on that name ring there you saw, must be in this area because it's only 2 name rings away from Aruna. It's nowhere else. It's got to be very close to Aruna. So when you look at it, if you actually look at the distances involved, it's around 100 kilometers from Aruna and Yad HaMelech to the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. Therefore, Champollion was mistaken in identifying Judah the kingdom in this campaign. When we look more carefully at the text, 2 Chronicles 12:9, so Shishak, the king of Egypt, advanced on Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything away, including the golden shields which Solomon had made. So where is Jerusalem? If this guy, Shoshenq, is Shishak, surely Jerusalem must be a captive city that you see on that list. After all, it's the biggest city in the area, the richest city in the area. He's not going to simply miss it out. He's going to include it in this relief. But when you look for it, you don't find it. Here you can see a part of the wall where it should be, and you can see that the name rings are not destroyed in that lower row. And here we can read 2 very famous cities in the Bible, Gibeon, Gabayana, and on the other side, Mahanaim, Mahanaim. So if you know your geography, Gibeon is on the way up through the Shephelah, leading up to the hill country, the road that goes over north of Jerusalem and descends down into the Jordan Valley, and that's where you'll find Mahanaim on the far side of the Jordan. So Jerusalem should appear between the 2, and it's not there. So basically what we're saying here is that there is no Jerusalem, there is no kingdom of Judah in this inscription. It's a completely different campaign. If we look at the overall first 3 rows, this is where Jerusalem should be, and this is Yad HaMelech down here, and Aruna over here. The 2 don't relate. This campaign is not against the kingdom of Judah. If we look at the fortified strongholds of Rehoboam that you see here on this map, what you find is that they are actually not the subject of the campaign of Shoshenq. Shishak attacks Judah. He comes up from Egypt and attacks these fortified settlements and goes on to Jerusalem. If we look at Shoshenq's campaign, and here's a list of some of the highlights of that campaign, he comes up the coast, and then he bypasses Judah and crosses over the hill country and descends down into the Jordan Valley. He then goes up the Jezreel Valley, comes through the Aruna Pass onto the Sharon Plain, and then he heads down and he does a little campaign down in the Negev. So if you look at that, what he doesn't do is go to Judah. He misses Judah like the plague. He's nowhere near Judah. In fact, his campaign is all about Israel, the northern kingdom. That's where he's focused. He's not focused on Judah at all. And then he's focused on the Negev in the south. So the one place that Shishak goes to, Judah, Shoshenq does not go to. And yet, if you read your Bibles, you'll find that actually the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam's kingdom, who is the competing king in this divided monarchy period, he went down to Egypt and was an ally, a protege of Pharaoh. So there's no way in the world that Shishak will be campaigning against his ally and ignoring his enemy, Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So the two campaigns, the one of Shoshenq and the one of Shishak, simply don't match. All you're left with then is this name Shoshenq and Shishak that sound vaguely similar. So what I did was I questioned this whole issue. I said, you cannot date the entire Egyptian history on the basis of this dodgy synchronism. Is that a word you all understand, Americans? Dodgy? It means a bit suspicious, okay? So the conclusion has to be, Shoshenq I does not appear to be Shishak of the Bible, the plunderer of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And once we get over that issue, for instance, here's a quote from one of the leading professors in Egyptology. He says, this is Eric Hornung, there remain many uncertainties about the Third Intermediate Period, as critics such as David Rohl have rightly maintained. Even our basic premise of the 925 BC for Shoshenq campaign in Jerusalem is not built on solid foundations. So if you have 925 BC, the biblical date for year 5 of Rehoboam, you cannot fix Shoshenq to that date because the two campaigns do not match. They are not the same person. The biblical Shishak is not Shoshenq of the Bible.
David, could I just ask you a question here? Why is it so important? What does Egypt give the rest of the Mediterranean world, the ancient world?
That's a very good question.
The reason why this is critical is because I didn't know this, but you explain.
Okay. Because Egypt is the richest ancient world nation in terms of texts, because of the preservation of the desert, because they carved in stone, they've got so much material for people to study like me. And therefore they lend this authority to the rest of the ancient world. If you go to Megiddo, for instance, in the Holy Land, or any biblical city, Hatzor, or wherever you like, you won't find an inscription on the walls. You go to the so-called Solomonic date, it doesn't have a label saying this is built by King Solomon. You go to Egypt, and you can look for a gateway of Ramesses II, and his name's all over it. So you know who built that. You can't say the same thing for the Bible lands. So what you do is, scholars date the archaeology of the Holy Land based on finding Egyptian artifacts in the ground. So if you dig up a scarab of Ramesses II in a particular level, you date that level to Ramesses II. It's not dated by the Bible at all. It's dated by ancient Egypt. And that goes for Greece, it goes for Turkey, it goes for Cyprus, it goes for Crete, it goes for Sudan. All those civilizations get their dating from Egypt. They borrow it from Egypt. So if Egypt's wrong, everything else is wrong. Does that answer your question?
And that's where the challenge comes, because people are reluctant to suggest anything is wrong because they've already somewhat poured the cement and it's hardened.
Absolutely. It's carved in stone, literally. The Egyptian dating from the time of Champollion has been carved in stone ever since. And the only way to solve the problem is to knock the monument down and build it again from the foundation upwards, which is my job is to do that. I'm not on my own, by the way. There's a number of other scholars working on this as well. But Hornung recognizes the issue. We are not safe with our Egyptian chronology. It is by no means fixed the way everybody says it is. And as you'll see in the movie this evening, there are scholars who say you can't touch Egyptian history by more than about 10 years. It's the most you can adjust it. We're talking about centuries here. So here is a circular argument for you. Egyptologists use the Bible to date the start of the 22nd dynasty. This is Shoshenq, to 945 BC. The reason is that Shoshenq campaigned in the Holy Land, in Canaan, in his year 20. So you backdate to his year 1. So his dynasty begins in 945 BC, based on the Bible. They then date Ramesses II, our so-called Pharaoh of the Exodus, by calculating backwards from that position, from 945 BC, adding up the reign lengths going back through the 21st dynasty and the 20th dynasty back to the 19th dynasty, where you find Ramesses. So Ramesses gets his date from the biblical synchronism. You following? They then find no evidence for the Exodus and the conquest in the time of Ramesses II. Wonder why? So what do? They therefore reject the Bible and call it a work of pious fiction. Think about what's going on here. So the Bible is used to establish Egyptian chronology, which is then used to dismiss the Bible. Now that's a beautiful case of circular reasoning. Don't use the Bible to date Egypt. Date Egypt from the internal evidence and then look for synchronisms with the Bible. That's the right methodology. Now, I told you this was going to be complicated. Are you still following me? So, if we've dismissed Shoshenq as the pharaoh who plundered the Temple of Solomon, it's my job to come up with the real Shishak. Is it not? Because I don't believe you can knock something down without rebuilding it. So this is my reconstruction. And you're going to be shocked now when you read that subheading. Was Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, the biblical Shishak? Suddenly, Yul Brynner, playing Ramesses, is no longer an adversary of Moses, Charlton Heston. He's now become the guy who took the golden shields from the temple. Is that even remotely possible? Well, it is. And it's all about a name, which I'm going to go into now for you. So now we're going to get into really complicated linguistic arguments. This is a tablet, clay tablet, that was found in Turkey at the capital of Hattusa of the Hittite Empire. You know, the Hittites are mentioned in the Bible. Now, it just so happens that in year 5 of Ramesses II, he fought the most famous battle in ancient history against the Hittites. It's called the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh being in North Syria and the Orontes River. And about 15 years later, after a lot of fighting, the Hittite emperor and Ramesses decided to make a peace treaty. They said, no more fighting. We're going to be buddies from now on, and we're going to protect each other if we have any trouble. Well, this is the Hittite version of that treaty. It's also recorded on the walls of Karnak in hieroglyphics. Now, this is something you have to understand. Just like Hebrew, Egyptian language does not have any vowels written. Okay, so just consonants. So when you read a name, you should not expect, in Egyptians, you will not see the consonants within that name. However, the language of the Akkadian language that the Hittites used to record on this treaty, and they use for all their diplomatic correspondence, is a syllabic language, not a consonantal language. So they do sound the vowels. So you get groups of letters, ta, mi, da, mu, nu. Those are all little syllables with vowels. So when they record the name of Ramesses on this tablet, saying Ramesses signed this treaty with King Hattusilis III, you actually get the name Ramesses written in cuneiform Akkadian. And you can read that with the vowels. Okay? Now you're going to get a shock, because you think he's called Ramesses, don't you? He's not. Ramesses is the Greek version of his name. It's not actually the name that it was pronounced in Egypt or anywhere else in the ancient world. So you're now going to learn what his name really sounded like. Well, the first part of his name, because he has two names, he has a birth name and a coronation name. So the coronation name comes first, and then his birth name comes second. You see it in two cartouches. We Egyptologists, we have something called Egypto-speak. It's a sort of way we communicate with each other so we can refer to these things in our own way. And what we do is we insert the letter E wherever we don't know the actual value of a vowel. So we go, Usamatre Setepenre. That's his coronation name. But on this treaty, it doesn't sound like that at all. It sounds like Washmoria Shatapnaria. That's actually how it sounded to the clerks, the ambassadors, when they wrote down the name of Ramesses as they heard it in ancient Egyptian. Washmoria Shatapnaria. So Uza Matre is Wash Uza, Mua Mart, Ria is Ra or Re. Shatapnaria is Setepenre, so we call it Setepenre, but Shatapnaria. So when you get to the ancient language, you can start to learn a lot more about the reality of the language and the reality of the names of these people. And we'll do this with Joseph later as well. So then his birth name, Ramesses Meriamun, as we say, is Riamashisha Miamana. So Amun in ancient Egyptian is really pronounced Amana. As we know, Ra is Ria. Mash is the same as Moshe in Hebrew, born of. And Shisha, the end of that name, is very important because in the ancient world, nobody was going to go, every time they wanted to speak about this king, Washmira, Shatapmaria, Riamashesha, Miamana. It was too much of a mouthful. So they gave him a nickname. We call it a hypochoristicon. What that means is a short form of your name. I'll give you an example. Timothy and Tim. Lady Di, Princess Diana. Some people say Dave for David. We all have these short form names. They're not like a nickname, like Shorty or Blondie or Fatso. They're short forms of the name. And it's very commonly used today without realizing we use these hypochoristicons. Well, the ancient world was no different. The ancient world was exactly the same. Kings were called by short form names. It just so happens that Ramesses had a short form of his name, which was used all over the Levant, in Syria, in the Holy Land, and in Egypt. The common folk, the ordinary folk, gave him a short form of his name. And it's based on that. They called him Shisha. Are you starting to smell Shishak in that? But hang on a minute. What happened to the Kof, the K, at the end? Why is there no K, as in Shishak? Well, here we have a little conundrum for you. Let me show you the development of two letters from the Hebrew alphabet, right from the very beginning of the development of the original alphabet that we use today. Here we see two letters. We have the Q, the Kof, and the Wav, the W. I'm going back through time, through Hebrew, Greek, Paleo-Hebrew, Phoenician, right the way back to something called Proto-Sinaitic. Now, later on today, I'm going to take you to a turquoise mine in Sinai, where we find the first evidence of the Hebrew alphabet in use in ancient Egypt, developed out of the hieroglyphs by one genius. And you'll find out who he is later. But in that particular case here, we have a sign which crops up over and over again, this one. You see it coming? We call it the lollipop. What do you call the lollipop? Popsicle, is that right? Over here?
Tootsie Pop.
Okay, that'll do. So look at that sign appears in both the letter Wav and the Kof. But in time, it evolves. So, in the 15th century, in Proto-Sinaitic, in Sinai, it's a Wav. So this lollipop is a Wav.
And this is an older time period. In other words,
So what do you mean?
you're coming from 15th century BC.
This way,
Yeah,
towards
so,
the present.
Yeah, so this is the older on the right-hand side.
This is the oldest one.
Yeah.
Then when we get to the 8th century BC, the lollipop has shifted up and now has become a Kof. Okay? Now, what happens between the 15th century and the 8th century? Well, that's where Shishak is located, just after the death of Solomon in the 10th century. So which sign are we looking at? The scribe sees this sign, and he doesn't know whether it's a Wav or a Kof. So our first clue is this Isbet Sata Ostrakon is an alphabet, an abecedary. You can see the letter Aleph here, Tav at the end. This is the first time we see the alphabet written in the 9th century. It's a schoolboy's practice piece on a piece of pottery. And here we have a resh, and here we have a kof, okay, in the right position within the alphabet. So we know in the 9th century, the lollipop represented the kof. Okay? So 9th century, this is the time after Solomon. This is now the divided monarchy period. If a scribe came across that letter, he would read it as kof. Okay? Go back to the time of Ramesses II and the city of Lachish, stratum 4, you get this inscription. Again, reading Bostraphaedon, so that direction and then this direction. And here you will see the letter is a wav. So we have clear evidence that in the time of Ramesses, this letter represented, the lollipop represented a wav, and in the time of the divided monarchy, it became the letter kof. So there's a wav, and it's the 12th century BC. On no revised chronology here, this is the date for Ramesses and the conventional scheme. So there's our two symbols from the two sources. Are you struggling to find a difference? It's like if we take this symbol in our modern alphabet. If you don't take it in context, you can't read what that is. But if I put the three contexts it might be a capital I in the word identical. Or it might be a lowercase l in the word letter. Or it might be the number 1 in 1000. It all depends on context as to how you read that stroke, that vertical stroke. So we have the same problem with wav and kof, except it's in a name. And a name doesn't have a context. So you can't tell which it is. So here is the name Ramesses, is short form name, Sisa. This wav here in hieroglyphs is a vowel marker. You don't know the value of the vowel, it could be anything, but we believe from the Hittite inscription that it's an A. So Sisa and Shishak, without the vowels from the Bible. There it is written in Proto-Hebrew, Sin Yod, Sin Wav. And here is Shishak, Sin Yod, Sin Kof. Can you tell the difference? So, let's say for argument's sake, in the time of Josiah, when they found the sacred scroll in the temple, and they read it out to the people, that the scribe, who eventually wrote down the name as Shishak and vocalized it Shishak, had an older document where the word was really Sisa or Sisu with a wav. And that's where the K comes from. So we have a mistake in the reading because of the change of the sign from wav to kof, which is why Shisha becomes Shishak. So in fact, Ramesses II in his Hypercharisticon, known in Israel as Shisha, is Shishak of the Bible, plunderer of Solomon's temple. That is the big mistake in chronology. Because now we're in a situation where everything was tied to that link between Shoshak and Shishak, and Ramesses was assigned to Moses. Everything was out of kilter, because what we had wrong was we identified the wrong king who plundered the Temple of Solomon, and in fact it's Ramesses II. So no longer is he the bad, he's no longer the bad guy. Are you all right?
Steve, I'm sorry. It must be the dust from Ramesses got it in my nose, yes.
So now we've got a situation on our hands where everything in the timeline is now floating. We have now a chance to see how it really fits together. And that is the key to understanding how the mechanism that leads to the film works. None of this is in the film. You don't get this in the film because it's too complicated to put on a big screen.
Well, here's the thing from a filmmaking standpoint, because this idea is, many people will say, radical, blasphemy. This is not part of our orthodoxy. And yet David, as he continued to defend his ideas, they continued to make sense. And some people said, Well, they make too much sense, so they can't be right. I guess in the academic world, if it makes sense, it can't be right because everything else, doesn't make sense. So
the expression they use is, it's too good to be true.
Too good to be true.
Have you heard that one before?
But I have to tell you that there are other examples of evidence for the biblical narrative showing up earlier, like the 104th Psalm, I believe. Is that correct?
Psalm 104.
Yep, Psalm 104 shows up earlier, and it's attributed to Akhenaten.
Correct.
And because of that, what they are saying, even at Christian universities, is that the Bible gathered its sources from a variety of places. And
David nicked it from Akhenaten, is what they say,
yeah,
to put it politely.
And
instead of it being the creation of David and then Akhenaten borrowed it from David, because in this timeline you're going to see working out here, and it's going to be in one of the later films, is Akhenaten is actually contemporary with David. So the two of them are reigning at the same time. This, what Psalm 104 comes into Egypt as the hymn to the sun, and you have the two at exactly the same time period.
And what did Akhenaten do? What did he say? There was only one?
He said there was only one God. And so he gets labeled by historians as the first monotheist. Okay? But with this revised chronology, everything goes back to normal. Moses becomes the first monotheist. And Akhenaten is the copier, not the originator.
And David, wouldn't you say that what you were suggesting too is that the problems aren't necessarily, he didn't start with the Bible. He just basically ended up saying, well, how did this impact the biblical narrative? What he started with was that Egypt has pharaohs, the whole dating of the pharaohs and things were out of place.
You know, my PhD thesis was on the Third Intermediate Period.
Right.
It had nothing to do with the Bible at all.
But he just then said, well, what are the other communities that this affects? Mm-hmm. And then all the other patterns started to show up. And so as a filmmaker says, am I going to make a film that's dodgy, as you would say?
Dodgy.
Yes. I said, well, let's look and see how dodgy this really is. And actually, there is a sequential pattern, and we've only showed you part of it. There's a lot more to the patterns. And what I would say is that I'm going to say you have to make up your mind. We're going to show you strong evidence, and then the evidence and the Bible, you can think about that and make your own decisions. And that releases everyone from us saying, well, this is exactly this or whatever. But it makes too much sense to me as a filmmaker I couldn't make a film if it wasn't something there. You can't write a story and you can't look at these things. We're not doing smoke and mirrors here. And like Brian Wood said, I didn't plant the evidence in the ground. You can't do that. All you can do is interpret it. And so what his interpretation does make sense. And that's the reason why I felt that you needed to know. Otherwise, right?
Yeah, it's not just that though. I mean, for me at least, and I would have thought for most people, normal people, isn't this exciting to be able to re-examine all this stuff and try and piece it together? Why are these archaeologists and historians so scared of it? Why don't they want to talk about it? Tell me a little thing about, I'm not going to mention any names here of any particular colleges, but the film was shown a few nights ago at a very, very, very impressive and important college in this country, biblical college. And they said they would show it on the basis that I would not turn up to defend it. Okay, and then they gave this diatribe, having seen the film, saying why it was completely rubbish and nothing worked, and they just launched into their student body without anybody there to defend the position of the film or anything. Their attitude, one of the scholars, a very famous scholar, stuck a photograph of me up when I was a rock and roll star on the screen and said, would you trust this man to reconstruct your history for you? Because look, he's a rock and roll person, he's not a real scholar. Ignoring all my degrees and all my other things that I've got. So anyway, we're going to wind up very soon. I just want to show you why Ramesses is the key to all this. Now, it's all about this thing called the Israel Stela. Have you heard of that? It's the most famous inscription in Egypt because it's a great stela by King Meneptah, which mentions Israel at the bottom of it, which is why it's called the Israel Stela. Here is the name Israel at the bottom. You can hardly make it out, but if I just highlight the text, you have the two reeds again that we saw earlier, which is the Y, yish, then you have S, then you have the R, the mouth, ri, al. Now, in Egyptian, there is no letter for L, so they use the letter for R. So, Israel, and then you have the throw stick, which is the determinative figure for an Asiatic or a Semite. Then you have two figures, the man and the woman, seated together, with plural strokes at the bottom. Now, those plural strokes indicate that this is a people. So it's the people of Israel that's written here, or the nation of Israel. Now, remember that Meremptah is the successor of Ramesses II. Ramesses II reigned for 66 years. His son came to the throne in old age, and he recorded this inscription. He wasn't really in the position to do much fighting himself. He was rather too old to do so. And nevertheless, he mentions the defeat of a people of Israel. Now, what is the context of this? Well, the text actually says, Israel, and then it continues, is laid waste. His seed, because his, referring to Jacob, Israel, is no more. That's a standard phrase within Egyptian texts for defeated people. It doesn't mean anything specific. It just means we've defeated Israel. They're conquered. Now, the Meremptah stele indicates a nation of Israel already existing in the Holy Land during the late 19th dynasty. Now, if you think about it, if Moses was a contemporary of Ramesses and the Israelites had left in the reign of Ramesses II, how on earth could they be a nation already established in Canaan? They were wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. This doesn't make sense. If we look at the context of the text, it's actually a poem. It actually goes for several lines describing lots of different nations, and I'll just show you the actual poem itself. It says, the princes are prostrate, saying shalom. And it does actually say shalom in the text. Not one raises his head amongst the nine bows. The nine bows are the traditional enemies of Egypt. Desolation is for Chehanu. Chehanu is Libya. Hatti, the Hittites, is pacified. Plundered is Parcanaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gezer. Yanoam is made non-existent. Now, there are 4 major towns in the Holy Land. Then it goes, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Charu, which is Syria, has become a widow because of Egypt. Then the last 2 lines are, all lands together are pacified, everyone who was restless has been bound. Now, people have studied this text and realized something. It's actually balanced. It's actually what we call a reflection poem. In other words, if I put the units in, you can see it starts with 2 lines, 2 sentences, and it ends with 2 general sentences. So there's actually a pattern evolving here. It's another one of these patterns. It then has, B, 2 major entities. Chehanu is the entire Libya. Hatti is the entire Turkey. Then it has Israel, wherever that is, and the entire Syria. So in this context, Israel is a major power. It's as big as the Hittites. It's as big as the Libyans. It's as big as Syria. And then in the middle, we get 4 towns. Parcanaan is Gaza. Ashkelon, you know, is one of the Philistine cities. Gezer and Yanoam. So this tells us straight away, this is not a bunch of Israelites wandering around the desert. This is an actual kingdom we're dealing with here, a major power. That is not possible if Moses is a contemporary of Ramesses II. It's out of the question. Whereas if Ramesses II is a contemporary of Solomon, which we just worked out because he's Shishak, then we have a completely different ballgame here. We have the kingdom of Solomon mentioned here in this text. So here are the inscriptions of that text actually on the walls of Karnak. The poem is actually a scribe comes along, he wanders along the walls of Karnak, he writes down all the defeated peoples, and he makes this poem for his master, Pharaoh Meneptah. So here is the Libyans being fought, Chehanu being defeated by the Pharaoh. Here are the Hittites on the same wall, being taken away in captive. And then we have the city of Parcanaan, the next one on the list here, Gaza, with the Shasu Bedouin. There's the name, you can read it here, Demien, which is the city of Parcanaan, Gaza. Now, all these places are located on the wall reliefs of Seti I, who is the grandfather of Merneptah. So the first three defeated enemies of Egypt, Chehenu, Hatti, and Parkenon, are drawn from the victorious campaigns of Seti I at Karnak. So if we then go round to the other side of the hypostyle hall to look at the campaigns there, the remaining 5 defeated enemies, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, Israel, and Karu, Syria, are drawn from the victorious campaigns of Ramesses II, which are on the far side of the temple. So if we look at a map or a plan, this is the hypostyle hall between the second pylon and the third pylon. This is where the Shoshenq relief is, outside here. He's campaigning into northern Israel. And what we have is the battle against Libya. Chehenu is on the outside wall here. On the upper register is the battle against the Hittites, Hatti, and then we have Parkenon on this wall here. All those are Seti I campaigns. Then we cross over to the far side, and we get the campaigns of Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel there, and we get the campaign against Syria along here. So if you walk around Karnak, it matches exactly with the poem. Okay, so these are not the victories of Merneptah. They are the victories of his dynasty, his grandfather and father. He's too old to do any of this. So he's claiming for his dynasty as he sits on the throne, as I look out upon my empire, this is what my dynasty has achieved. So here we have a golden opportunity to actually look at the defeat of Israel on the walls of Karnak. Instead of having a text, we now have visuals we can look at. So I'm going to show you what we have of that. Sadly, it's very scanty. So here is the Syria wall on the outside of the temple, and we're going to go over here to this area to look at this particular wall. We call it the Ashkelon wall today. In the center, we have the Hittite treaty here, and we have 4 campaigns, one there, one above, mostly destroyed, and then tantalizing just a few blocks of a scene on this side. And unfortunately, that's where Israel's located. So we have Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel. So I'm going to take you to look at those few blocks. Here we see the campaign against Ashkelon. Here's the town here. You remember the story in the Bible of the king of Moab offering his own child when the Israelites come to besiege the city? Well, here we have the king dropping his own child off the battlements in sacrifice to stop Ramesses II from defeating them. But above this scene, here's the name Ashkelon, Ashkelana. This is what we're interested in. That is what's left of the battle against Israel. Now, you can't see very much, I admit, but when you examine it closely, there's a melee here. There's lots of bodies being killed here. We have a horse here. We have a chariot wheel. We have a larger horse, the back legs of a larger horse. I'll try and help you out with this. And then we have captives being taken away with long gowns on down to their ankles, taken off as prisoners towards Egypt. Now, that's what we have today, but what I was able to do was take a similar scene from another part of Karnak to reconstruct that so you can see what it is. So watch this happen and you'll see what the scene is all about. So now you can see clearly what it is. You have Ramesses II and his chariot over here on the missing section. His chariot horses here, the large ones, prancing with the reins of the king going across here. And underneath the horses of the chariot team, is a smaller chariot with a small wheel, in which we have Semites falling dead. And the horse, if you notice here, the tiny horse is running away from the battle, running away from Ramesses in defeat. So what is this representing? There you can see the horse in more detail. You'll notice here, if we go closer, the head of the horse is down, exhausted. It's not a proud Egyptian horse. This is a defeated Israelite horse driving a chariot, or pulling a chariot. Now think about this. If Moses, Yul Brynner, was a contemporary of Charlton Heston, Ramesses II, and this is Ramesses II fighting against Israel, and Israel has got chariots, there's something very wrong there. Moses didn't have chariots. Moses took the people out of Egypt without chariots. If you look through your Bible, you won't find mention of Israelite chariots until the time of late David and Solomon. Solomon who built chariot cities. All the time before that, whenever the Israelites, who were basically an infantry group, fought against people with chariots, they would lead them into quagmires and swamps so that the chariots became inactive. Or, for instance, when Saul fought the Philistines, he moved his troops up Mount Gilboa so they couldn't use the chariots. The enemy couldn't use the chariots on the slopes. So, for example, in Joshua, the Lord said to Joshua, "You will hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. We have no use for them. We don't know how to ride them. We don't know how to drive them." And a scholar, typical reference from a scholar here, only during the monarchy period did the horse become important for chariot warfare. That reinforces my argument that Shishak is Ramesses, Shisha, because in his time he was fighting against the United Kingdom of Solomon and his successor Rehoboam, who did have chariots. And we know that Ramesses fought against Israel somewhere in the hill country.
So, David, what you're suggesting is that the Merneptah poem is reestablishing the greatness of the great defeats that the dynasty, Seti the first and
Seti the first and Ramesses
the second, and that those defeats then are visually represented on the Karnak temple.
Yeah. Essentially what you've got is a pharaoh in his mature years, maybe 65 years old, sitting on his throne, needs some monument to celebrate something, wants to be proud of something. He hasn't done much in his own reign, so he thinks, now what have my family done? Well, all over the walls of Karnak are the records of these wonderful campaigns. So he sends a scribe off with a notepad, bit of papyrus, says, write down the history of my ancestors, my grandfather and father, write down what they achieved, and I'll sign the bottom of it and say, this is my dynasty, I'm proud of this. So we can then say that Ramesses was the one who fought against Israel, whatever that fight was, whatever that battle was. So that's the situation we're in. We're in a situation where Ramesses has no longer got the bad press of being the pharaoh of the oppression, the pharaoh of the Exodus. He's now a king of Egypt who came up and virtually put an end to the rule of Solomon's dynasty, if you like, with Rehoboam. Rehoboam became a servant of Egypt once this plundering had taken place, as the Bible says.
So the taking of the shields from the temple would have been that defeat.
Yes, the treasures that came out of the temple and from the palace would have gone back to Egypt in the time of Ramesses II, who was the wealthiest pharaoh in the entire history of Egypt. Now, I just want to close with another piece of evidence very shortly, which is very important also to show you that Israel was already well established in the Holy Land, in the kingdom of Israel, before the time of Ramesses. So if Ramesses is the pharaoh of the Exodus, what the heck is going on here? But we have a new piece of evidence, which you'll see in the movie as well. This only came up very, very recently, a couple of years ago. One Egyptologist was rooting around in the basement of the Berlin Museum that nobody had been in for donkey's years, and he came across a granite block from a pedestal of a statue which had been found in Egypt 100 years ago and had been stored in the basement of the museum. And he dusted it down and he started to read the names of the rings, the name rings of the captive peoples, the statue up here, and around the base you have a row of captive peoples. This fragment has 3 captive peoples on it. We're already familiar with them. Ashkelon, Ishkelana, Kiananu, Canaan. And then, unfortunately, sadly broken away, we have a few signs. And he realized that he could restore that name ring, and I'm going to do that for you now. Here it is on the broken edge of the block. Let's put the rest of it in from what we know. And suddenly, we have the name Israel. So, this is dated to the middle of the 18th dynasty, 100 years before Ramesses. And yet, on this block, we have the name Israel as a defeated nation. Israel. So that proves positive for me that there's no way that Ramesses II could be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It's absolutely out of the question. So what we're going to do this afternoon is to tell you who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who was the Pharaoh of Joseph's famine, when it all happened, when Jericho fell. All those things we're going to deal with this afternoon. But this was my journey. This was the way I came to the realization that I couldn't be an ordinary Egyptologist working in my ivory tower, teaching students for the rest of my life, that I had to take this and actually introduce it to the world, because I think it's really important that we realize that the reason why we have the pious myth of scholars about the Bible is because they've made a huge blunder in the way they work the timeline out of ancient Egypt. And that is the key to understanding where the real Bible is located. Thank you.
This excellent presentation today, and looking forward to this afternoon. And as Tim was talking about this, what he started out on this journey, I remember being up in his studio twice up in Minnesota. I made a call to him and asked if I could come down and take a look at the movie. I saw the first movie that he did, and, oh, you got to get this out. He said, I've got some tweaking to do on it. A couple years later, I get a call, come back, take a look at it. It's a different thing, but I said, oh, you got to get this out, and said, yeah, it's being scored over in Hungary or something.
Right. It was completely scored with a full orchestra and choir, and I mean, this production is at the highest level. We won a lot of awards around the nation, and people have said it's one of the highest quality documentaries. You know, for example, when you look at Jericho, we actually got the footprint of the archaeological dig. And so when you look at the scenes of Jericho, we rebuilt Jericho and worked with David and other scholars to basically give you exactly what it might look like. We also took Avaris, the city underneath the city of Ramesses, which we'll talk about, where Joseph's family came. We rebuilt it exactly according to the dig sites. So when I looked at those pictures, I realized that, and I wanted to do that for the historical purposes, was that you might be getting an impression what it looked like, in the eyes of Moses or in the eyes of Joseph, what their homes and what their dwellings might have looked like. We have this amazing Terrigen software that you can put in the sky and the sea and the water and the plant life. And we've recreated those exactly according to how they would have looked. And so the authenticity was a real, I took the time to take and make it authentic. And we always said, well, what's the right way, not what's the easy way. And yeah, that's why it took such a long time to basically get it right. And but you know what? I don't have any regrets. I just know that we've always tried to make it the best we could make it, and to choose the right path.
That's right. And after seeing the second version of the path of the Exodus, and trying to encourage you, get this thing out. Then after I saw patterns of evidence, and I saw the level at which you had done it with the computer graphics and in really reconstructing this, then I realized the treat that you have in store for us, hopefully this next spring, with the releasing of the second one, which will be the culmination of the first two that you showed me.
Well, you know, it's going to be a little bit longer than that, but we're working on the next one. We're still trying to raise money for it, and they take a while to put it all together and trying to get our arms around all the ideas that are in the films. But we've got a lot of it in the can, and we're developing new products, and so we're just excited to be able to be here and to share. And we've got a lot more coming this afternoon, and it's going to be great.